My name is Annette Idler. I'm the director of the Global Security Program at Pembroke College and also faculty member here at the Blavatnik School of Government. First of all, before we start, I would like to express my thanks to the DT Institute, which provides generous support for the series, the Blavatnik School of Government and Pembroke College, and of course also my team, and especially Frederick Florence, who's been coordinating everything behind the scenes. This is the second webinar in our new series on global security, and it follows an exciting opening roundtable last week on thinking about global security, where we had Professor Deborah Arendt, Professor Pina Peking, Sir Adam Roberts, and Professor Hamati-Ataya joining us. Now, the series runs through what we call in Oxford the second half of Hillary term and the first half of Trinity term. So that means for the next 3 weeks, then we have a spring break, and then we start again for 4 weeks in the summer. The purpose of this webinar series is to explore the meaning and practice of global security. Now, this is an intellectual effort that forms part of our research program on global security here at Oxford. And in that research, also the Minerva program on global security, we study how local contested spaces, transnational illicit flows, and shifts in global order influence each other, and how these interactions may lead to threats to global security. So within that, we focus on a number of key elements to theorize and think about global security. And that's how we've structured the webinar series. So last week, when we launched the series, we had a really rich discussion, and I would just like to pick up 3 points, kind of takeaway points from that discussion that might be useful to reflect on also this week. So one was a broader historical perspective. And we thought about what happens when certain global orders and the security related to it, when they dissolve, what types of orders might arise afterwards. So the social, the economic, the political orders, but also what does this mean for global security? And we've seen, that was pointed out by panelists, some sort of reversal towards national security, actually, given the threats that we are currently facing. This reversal to national security rather than other concepts like human security or global security that we're talking about, that might, of course, not necessarily be helpful for enhancing security at the global level. And this is then how we discussed also how global security might serve as an umbrella to fit those different types of threats and concepts underneath them. Second key point is that the way we think about global security should not be about shifting the referent object of security or shifting the space, the location where we look at it, but it's really about understanding our approach to security, how we study it, being inclusive of voices from across the globe. That's the global in it. And then a third key point that was discussed was around new and emerging technologies. And they are crucial as an issue for global security that, of course, also connects with other issues like climate change. And the key part here is also that, in a way, novel technologies are both part of the threat, but of course also part of the solution. So the question is, how can we shift towards the solution then here? Next week, we'll be discussing spaces and also the space and scales in global security to consider how it manifests itself across those different scales, from the local to the global, but also across different types of cases of spaces, both the physical and the non-physical. Then in the following sessions, we'll look at the dynamic interactions of 3 dimensions. The political dimension, so looking at global order, geostrategic power. We look at the economic dimension, especially the licit and also illicit supply chains and how they're networked across the globe, and the social dimension, which refers to the local experiences of stability or instability. After that, we look at how those different dimensions interact with each other. And then finally, we'll have a closing roundtable on the future of global security. So I hope that you stay tuned and stay with us for the entire series. One important point about the webinar series is that we bring together academics with either policymakers or practitioners or scholars who also work as a practitioner or as an activist, And that's important to make sure that our intellectual engagement also helps tackle real-world security challenges. So there last week, for example, we reflected on how different and especially local actors need to be recognized also as knowledge producers and be kind of embraced in that conversation. Another point was that practitioners and students of global security should also avoid creating hierarchies between different ways of perceiving global security. So who is it who decides on what we mean by global security, how we think about this, and what that then means for practice? Now, of course, we are also very interested in understanding how our audience members understand and study global security, which of course is also the core of today's session, the methodologies, the epistemologies of global security. And so that's why we've prepared a very quick poll, and I'd really like to invite the audience members who are here in the webinar to just respond to the poll that we would like to start now. Let's see if that works. Could we please start the poll now? Here we see it. So here the question is, which of the following approaches do you use in your own work? So either combining social sciences with an arts-based approach, action-based research, or combining qualitative approaches with quantitative or STEM approaches, and then perhaps the more standard approach, quantitative, qualitative social science approaches. So while we're waiting for the results, I'd just like to introduce our distinguished guests today. And I'm very delighted, I'm thrilled to have with me, I think the perfect experts for that session on methodologies and epistemologies. And here with me are, first of all, Dr. Inanna Hamati-Ataya from the University of Cambridge. She's a principal research associate and principal investigator on the ERC-funded project Artifact, and also founding director of the Center for Global Knowledge Studies. Her research lies at the intersections of world politics, global world history, social theory, natural and historical epistemology, and also the anthropology, history, and sociology of knowledge, science, and technology. Welcome, Inanna, to the webinar. Then with me is also Professor Verónica Zubillaga, who is an associate professor at the University of Simón Bolivar de Caracas. She has been also a visiting professor at Brown University, Harvard, and the University of Notre Dame. And Verónica combines her work, her research on armed violence and public policy with activism for a Venezuelan public policy, which respects the democratic guarantees of Venezuela. So I very much look forward to hearing also from you and the insights on the groundwork. And then last but not least, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Neil Johnson, Professor of Physics at George Washington University. He heads up a new initiative in complexity and data science that combines cross-disciplinary fundamental research with data science to attack complex real-world problems. And I'm particularly delighted to have been collaborating with Neil for a number of years now. And he is one of the co-investigators, together with Eduardo Lopez as well, on our exciting new Minerva Global Security Program, where we do combine the social sciences with looking at complexity. So I'm delighted to have you here. Well, let's look at the results of the poll before we start. It's actually quite diverse. We do have around 21% working also combining social science with arts-based approach. Some people use action-based research, and then some combine qualitative approaches with quantitative STEM approaches. But it looks like the majority is still within the social sciences and looks at quantitative and qualitative work. So I very much hope that this panel will be an encouragement and prompt perhaps some of our audience members to go beyond perhaps the more conventional approaches and also look at other ways of studying that. Well, with that, let me turn to our panelists. And I'd like to start by just asking you if you could just briefly summarize how you study global security. What is your approach to that? Inanna, would you like to go first?
Sure, thank you very much, Annette. I suppose the easiest way of describing it is that I'm interested in what we may call civilizational security. So the fundamental, the threats and the risks that threaten the major social systems that enable humanity to sustain itself as a species embedded in natural and ecological and interspecific processes and relations on this planet, or at least for now on this planet. And of course, this relates politically, we have never really thought about these kinds of completely embedded kinds of threats until very recently, with a larger picture that has brought in the Earth systems as, you know, the major environment in which we evolve. But traditionally in political science and international relations, we have always thought about civilizational threats from, for example, a nuclear perspective, from, you know, arising from the social and political evolution of humanity. Whereas now we are really urged and encouraged to think about the more fundamental processes that anchor our survival on this planet. And by survival, I mean not simply reproduction, but survival is essentially adaptation. It's the capacity to always be adapted to the environments and to be adapted in a sustainable way. So I'm interested more specifically in those major systems. For example, of course, you know, food security is one that has become especially important today with the whole framework of the so-called Anthropocene. And my work is especially focused on what I would call the epistemic security that underlies our capacity as a collective organism, so to speak, to sustain ourselves in the long term. And of course, this notion means that we have to shift scales. So instead of looking simply at local scales or political units such as states and international organizations and even societies, we look at a macro scale of how that collective organism sustains itself and evolves and adapts on the long term. So there's also a geographical scale and a temporal scale, because most of these mechanisms cannot be understood on the short term, not even in the long term of historians, longue durée. They need to be understood in deep time, in deep history. And once you start thinking, of course, about our relations to the environment and to the planet, then the notion of social change has to be calibrated on the basis of the kinds of macro scale changes that happen to the planet, to the environment, to the ecology. Which we have never thought about because we never needed really to think about them, because for the past 10,000 years or so, we have benefited from a more or less stable environment. So the environment of the so-called Holocene, which is the Goldilocks period of human history that enabled us to, you know, settle down and develop the agrarian lifeway that we know, the industrialization of our production. But today we are confronted precisely with the disruption of this particular very short period in our history. And so we need to zoom out, I think, to understand not only the kinds of threats, but also how to secure the underlying structures of our material, but also our mental cognitive evolution, so that we can no longer think or see the world as states, for example, do, but as what a collective organism might be able to develop in terms of a vision of itself. So I would say see the world as this, you know, seeing as a species, but I know that many people are sensitive to that concept. So this is the kind of approach that I adopt and that I'm interested in my own research.
Thank you so much, Inanna. Thanks. Verónica, how about yourself?
Yes, thank you, Annette, for the invitation to share here with you and to get to know each other. So I will start saying that we work in an authoritarian context, and that means that we have another challenges as well. So, for instance, our universities have been affected by the cutting of funds dramatically, and the government also in Venezuela has stopped to publish information. So in this context, we have been developing our research focused mainly in armed violence, armed actors, police violence, victims, and the search for justice. So we have been forced to develop alliances among interdisciplinary colleagues in Venezuela, but also abroad, to be able to develop our research. And also we aspire to have public impact. So I will say that mainly four aspects of it. We work in communities for long periods of time. So I absolutely agree with Inanna about the importance of taking time to do research in order to apprehend social processes and changes in communities. We also develop a comparative perspective. So we work in different sites so we can understand the local dynamics in the same city, for instance. We also work with multiple actors so we can have enrich different perspectives and access complexity. For instance, we work with we interview armed actors, police officers, communities, and we have a special focus on women and youth. Another point is that we collaborate with organizations that are developing epidemiological monitoring of homicides. So in that sense, that allows us to have also a vision of the geospatial occurrence of homicides and all the characteristics. And finally, we have also developed, as I said before, networks with colleagues in Latin America, in the US and Europe. I will stay there.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Verónica. I think that was quite nice to see how we first heard about thinking about security from a kind of larger perspective, right? Inanna telling us, well, we could think about this in terms of the species, not so much about states. And I think Verónica grounded that even more by saying, well, in her case, right, doing work on the ground, that of course also means understanding the different types of local actors that are present, how one is able to connect to them, but also dealing with just practical constraints depending on the specific context that one is in. Neil, how would you add to that in terms of your approach to studying global security, which probably might be a little bit different?
Yes, thank you so much, Annette, and thank you so much to the other panel members. It's very excited to be on this panel with them. Yes, I'm a physicist. I look at things like this in the background, which really are ways of looking at the world that are data driven, but it's a slightly different kind of data driven approach. It's trying to assemble data, trying to look at patterns over scales, over time and over space, whatever we mean by space, locally, globally, and then trying to get some kind of understanding of how those numbers might have come about in order to make a kind of assessment of how things may behave in the future. So let me give you a concrete examples. So our work, which does look at threats in terms of conflict, in terms of economic, stock market crashes, people's pensions funds disappearing, pandemics, etc. We're very much focused on the idea of coupled threats. So I think we saw that in the last few years, unfortunately, how things that it's like having all analogies are okay until they break down, but I'll use one. A forest fire, kind of forest fire idea that a threat comes from a forest fire. Our approach is looking at, in some sense, coupled forest fires. I may have something flare up in the economic context. I may have something flare up in public health, a pandemic, for example, may have some outbreaks of public disorder, of violence, however these things are defined in terms of verb, oh, this is terrorism, or this is domestic violence, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It produces numbers. And these numbers, to some degree, may look random, but usually they have some kind of distribution, even if they're random. And so what we're very interested in is how these different forest fire, these different threats in these different areas, albeit economic, public health, in terms of violence, etc., can couple together. They don't always couple together, but it seems like in moments of some kind of crisis, they do. And so that gives a feel for what's at risk in one area of the world or of life, and how those risks begin to couple together. So I'm very excited to be on this panel talking about these kind of things. I know it's a different kind of approach, but in the end, given things like, by the way, this in the back is not space, this is the online threats to the US across different social media platforms. Even looking at this, you can see that patterns begin to appear that may be meaningful in terms of quantifying then future risk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neil. Thanks. Well, now we've shifted to the numbers, right? And also visualizations, understanding how visualizations can help us study global security, or how we can think about security-related issues in a different way. That brings us to another question that relates to the methods really to study global security, and what kind of innovations we can have, or do we even need them? Are we, is it correct to always look for new ways of studying them? Or should we also go back to perhaps methods that have been proven and tested? Let me now perhaps start with Verónica. Would you like to just tell us a little bit more about the methodological approach, and perhaps also in your case, especially how you think a rigorous methodological approach is also important to have impact on the ground? To what extent do we need rigorous methods with regard to your work also on the ground?
Yes, well, we do have a permanent engagement with complexity. So we do combine different methodologies and methods. And we are an interdisciplinary team of sociologists, psychologists, lawyers, and also we have started lately to work with artists. So another interesting perspective is also we have been developing phenomenological research concerned with guns, and it's interesting to focus in the object and then apprehend all the changes it has brought in the different communities. For instance, in terms of the history of the community, the geographies and the moral boundaries, but also in subjectivities. We do, as you said, and that is also one of the main challenges. We do aim to have social impact with our research. So we are, and especially because we are in a country where, and in Latin America in general, we suffer from police violence massively, and this is especially the case in Venezuela. So we are working lately with issues related to the search for justice, and starting to think about processes associated to adapting transitional justice in Venezuela. So we are learning a lot about Colombia and Chile, and in that sense, we are working in different levels. We are working with international lawyers from Colombia and Chile to start to think about this adapting transitional justice in Venezuela, but we are also working with journalists. And then the exchange there is very interesting, because this capacity of having very rich dialogues comes from the fact that we are in the field, and we are rigorous with our methods, so we can count on exchanges with journalists in order to aim to have impact. For instance, we are also working with these, as I said, international colleagues and journalists to start to have workshops about transitional justice and start to have the debate in Venezuela. But also we are working with artists and victims to to work with victims and subjectivities, but also to show other perspectives in society in general about the experience of victimhood. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Verónica. This is really interesting, also understanding how the different fields, I mean, you mentioned international lawyers, journalists, but also artists, right? Which is a completely different field, which is perhaps not so much at the forefront of people's minds when thinking about security-related issues. So that really allows us also to get to perceptions of people and how people's perceptions might change, because it is in a way a language, a non-verbal expression, basically, of what's happening that often helps us see things from a different point of view. Neil, would you like to add, and perhaps, when thinking about innovative methods, connecting that also to how that can be useful also for understanding those threats or for the impact that we've been talking about?
Yes, I particularly like the idea of the art representation, because in the end, even if one were to do the numbers, if that ends up as 3 pages in an appendix with various p-values, maybe that doesn't really tell an easy story for, certainly not policymakers. Even for, I'm looking at it, I'm not really quite sure what the conclusions are. If we could represent it visually, and that's one of the things we're trying to do in these representations behind, which are network representations. Of course, networks are a kind of interesting thing because they can represent time and space. Time if they're dynamical, if the links and nodes change. Space if, space is defined by the links. It could be closeness geographically, it could be closeness in terms of cultural similarities, it could be closeness in terms of, unfortunately, towns that have had similar spates of violence. But representing that visually, telling a story about I always see the numbers as and patterns in the numbers as providing a kind of, they're certainly not the whole story. They provide a kind of scaffolding for guiding the words and discussions, hopefully, but they've got to be represented in a way that people understand, not just a statistician, even though, to be honest, they're still arguing about p-values. It's got to be understandable across disciplines. It's no good, I understand it in my discipline and I don't care about your discipline. It's got to be, if we're going to make progress in these areas, these problems don't belong to a discipline. So representing them visually, artistically, in a way that people can appreciate, then I think is an absolute key goal for us all.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Representation, yes, of course, there can be through visualization or the arts. There are many different ways of doing that. Inanna, what is your take on innovative methods and how to link them also to impact? How would you see this from your perspective?
So I would start with a general methodological approach, which is certainly, I think everyone understands now that we need to get out of our disciplines and comfort zones and start to think in terms that are much more across disciplinary methodologies and perspectives. And this is even more important when you're shifting scales or when you're trying to understand how local issues impact global issues and vice versa, or when you're trying to address processes that cross these various scales or that unfold also at very different rhythms. And I think this is very important. You have some technologies or knowledges that are quite instantaneous, but you have also other processes that take a lot of time, intergenerational transmission, that are not also tangible in the same way that particular transformations might be material transformations. So the way that people's mental attitude shifts, this is not something that you can capture with the same methods that you would capture, for example, practices, or that you would capture particular technological or cultural productions or events, such as wars or etc. So I think it's important to be completely open-minded about methods, because they are just the means to achieve a set of ends, and until we have opened up completely to the different ways of inquiring into an object, understand that all objects are actually complex, that you can approach them from very different perspectives on the short term, on the very long term, that you can approach them as isolated or as embedded in a larger network of interactions. So I'm completely open-minded, and I think we have a real problem today with the structure of academic disciplines and curricula, even if we're constantly encouraged to be interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary. There are no structures for this. There are no blueprints, really. Although I think in some areas, such as complexity theory, or as I mentioned, Earth system scientists, they tend to think about how very different kinds of systems interact, and every system has its own ways of manifesting, its realities, and so that requires very different methods. And then, as Neil and Verónica mentioned, it's not just the research methods, it's also the methods that we use to integrate, so the analytical methods, and then the communication methods, which indeed are very much needed to break the isolation, the fragmentation of academic languages, the way that we communicate, the way that we make some aspects of reality meaningful to others. It's not possible to actually get, your point across if you cannot use a language, and we're not socialized into all these languages. So I might look at statistics and not understand them, or I might have an aesthetic repulsion of particular methods. And we need our curricula to actually break down all these walls and break that division between the qualitative and the quantitative, or the idea that only some methods are critical and others are not. So I think it's very important to just really be focused on the problem and be focused on the integration, the objective, rather than those methodological territories and turfs, or a particular conception of what constitutes the ultimate method or the ultimate, philosophy of knowledge. And unfortunately, as I said, I think there is a mental blockage here, where you can see it with some students who will say, oh, I don't need to study quantitative methods because I'm interested in, particular phenomena, which is very anti-intellectual. It's also completely against, the opening up of the horizon of knowledge, that you cannot simply shut your consciousness to different ways of knowing and different ways of understanding. So I think people who collaborate widely in interdisciplinary frameworks are socialized into this. There is an unlearning of the fragmentation of disciplines. But when you're a single scholar, an individual scholar trying to engage with a very wide range of topics, you have to go through the process of teaching yourself, basically, which is quite difficult, as I said, because you're not socialized into this. You're socialized into becoming very fluent in your own fields, in your own particular methodologies. But certainly, if we want to have, an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary perspective on global risks, then you really need to cross all these boundaries. And apologies, my canine companion has decided to bring in a squeaky toy into the room, so I'll just mute myself.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Inanna. You talk about not just research methods. You said we should also look at communication methods and different ways of approaching basically knowledge production, right? I think that's also an important point when it comes to the entire research process, because of course we're also taught to or teach almost to think in a very linear way of knowledge production, whereas these different ways of approaching security, for example, can happen throughout the research process. I mean, we've been drawing on visual thinking, right? That helps us not just as a communication methods. We were talking about visualizations, for example, to communicate an output, but it can also help us to integrate other people's perspectives, understand different narratives through visual thinking rather than text-based knowledge production. And that's another way of kind of shifting what you were just saying in terms of the dominant disciplines and the dominant narratives in a way on security. You also said that methods are only a means to achieve a certain sets of ends, and perhaps that in itself can be discussed. But I think there's another element to that, which then brings us to data, right? Because depending on what kind of data is available, we might also choose our methods, or depending on what we want to study or how we want to understand security. I mean, we've been talking now from the Earth system to very small issues on the ground, locally embedded in understanding those dynamics, for example, in Venezuelan neighborhoods. So if we think about those different scales and thinking about the different methods available, the different approaches available, how should we then think about the data? And is there also something to say in terms of combining different ways even of thinking about data? Neil, would you like to perhaps share your thoughts on that with us?
Yeah, I mean, they're absolutely fantastic points. And of course, really, every real world system that all of us are interested in, I mean, in every university and every policy are systems that are complicated in the sense that they have feedback processes across scales. And so even, making the decision, I'm only going to look at a certain scale. I mean, the only reason that works in science is because things are so well separated in scales. Sometimes they're not. The things we teach in undergraduate are well separated in scales because otherwise we can't set final exam questions, basically. But in reality, everything's coupled across scales. And the interesting phenomena come from coupling across scales. It's because something happened locally. There's unfortunately something like an earthquake or something, which is unfortunately in the news now, which then sparks off local unrest, which has been building up because the kind of economic situation was bad and in the pandemic. But you can imagine all of these couplings are really quite important. So then the question comes, well, I need data, but I'd love to have data across all of these scales, but I can't get it. So I'm going to get what is available. But even in that, there's a problem because maybe some of that data is aggregated. And the major problem I see is often people have a lot of data, but it can be misleading data because it's aggregated. If I aggregate, over it, in the end, when we aggregate history, we all, none of us are here because we're only here for a few minutes, as it were, on the universal clock. And so aggregating data is a very different picture from looking at it on the daily scale. And so I think that a kind of often people are too confident in their data, and so integrating the stories from non-numerical analyses of systems with the data is an absolute key thing to do.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Neil. Yeah, people are too confident of their data. I mean, also in terms of thinking about what consists or what does data consist in, right? And what is usable as data? How do we even think about it? I think it's important. Verónica, would you like to add on that?
Yes. Well, I will say that doing research in global security and in violence poses certain ethical and political issues. So we do research aiming to have, as I said before, public impact. So we work with quantitative data to have as well the arguments with weight sufficiently to demand and make the demand for public policy. So we do work with this epidemiological data, and we work, as I said before, with journalists to publish reports that are mainly aimed to have public access. But I will say that in my particular experience that I work with qualitative data and I do field work, main challenges have to do with fear and time. And fear is one question that poses obstacles if you want to do, for instance, a survey and you want to work in a community. It's very difficult to arrive and then do a survey. So one way to begin is with qualitative methods. I will say that there it is very important if you don't know the community. For instance, on the other hand, we have communities where we have been working for more than 15 years. So we know everybody and we can get there. But in other communities where you don't have any experience at all, it is very important to have that intermediate person that bridge the distances and is able to guarantee security for the community and for you. So fear is one thing that is very important. People have fear to talk. So it takes a lot of time to develop trust. And it takes also a lot of time to being able to perceive the trends in that community. So if you want to do research on urban violence and security issues with using qualitative methods, I will say that you have definitely to think about the question of time and then the question of fear. And finally, I will say that it is very important also to integrate different perspectives. For instance, you have to talk with armed actors, but you have to talk to the audience of those armed actors, for instance, people in the communities. And as I said before, we try to focus extensively in the experience of women, of mothers, but we also focus on the youth. And it is very important also to focus on police agents in the field, because that allows you to have a complex vision of the field. Thanks.
Thanks so much. This was quite a contrast, I would say. I mean, you really focus on how difficult even access can be, right? To get small amounts of data, how we need to invest time to establish trust relationships, and of course also what risks and ethical challenges fieldwork involves, whereas Neil was pointing to the other extreme, right? What do you do if you have large amounts of data, big data? How do we even make sense of that? So you can have kind of challenges on both ends. Inanna, what is your view on data?
Well, it's really a complex issue. I mean, there are so many epistemological also problems associated with the relation between the kind of data that you have and the kind of research that you can develop and where that data comes from. So with the social sciences, we are very much constrained very often with kinds of public data that are generated by particular institutions that have particular agendas or particular visions of the world. And these are the data that we can use, but they are already embedded in a particular paradigm and in a particular relation to reality. They're driven by a logic of understanding that is very often separate from the logic of intellectual inquiry. So there's a whole issue with the kinds of data that any political scientist or sociologist or anthropologist has access to. And then there's the data that you don't know that you need. And to me, this is one of the greatest challenges that I faced while developing, expanding beyond my discipline. So if you're thinking of risks or threats or security in any area of human life, it's very difficult to have a pre-understanding of the kinds of data that you think will be irrelevant. And so there is necessarily a period of exploration where you're just looking and trying to understand what might be relevant to a particular process. So epistemic security, for example, it can be, the structures of epistemic security. It could be data about, the presence of institutions, how knowledge flows are capable of being sustained, of being transmitted, how the capacity to act upon a particular knowledge in problem-solving modalities. But it could also have it could also belong to a very completely different kind of realm, such as the kind of epistemic security that is related to the mental security, the cognitive security at community levels. So this is not something that is easy to conceptualize in terms of ontologically. how do you capture this? How do you understand whether the essential mental structures of knowledge are sustained or are under threat? They can be under very, very obvious kinds of threats, such as wars, the destruction of human life, disease, etc. But there are other kinds of threats to the epistemic health, if you want, of communities that are very difficult to capture. And so I think you constantly need to be open to the kind of information that is relevant. You constantly need to question how that data was generated, but also what counts as relevant. So we know that in international organizations, for example, there are indicators of growth, of development, of progress, etc., that you cannot take for granted or at face value. And so you have to constantly redefine what is relevant and where to get it and how to assess it. And so when you're combining all these different kinds of data, of course, that there is a fundamental problem of coherence. I don't have the solution to it, but I think that I think that it goes hand in hand with the complexity of reality and the fact that the data are just manifestations of our own way of looking at it. So there might be an absolute nature to reality that is never translated into a data-based form that we can capture. But all the data is basically of our own production. So we have to be constantly aware of how they're generated and how we use them.
Thank you so much, Inanna. Yeah, I mean, that brings us back to the point about when you said, well, what counts as relevant, how can we even redefine it? It brings us back to perceptions as well, right? Because perceptions differ in terms of what is relevant. Perceptions differ in terms of what is the data that we should use. And that then again links to the different narratives that are created by being perhaps biased towards one approach or the other. And the other point about, I guess, the data, we don't know that we don't know, right? It's of course a larger problem that we face, not just in the area of security studies, but also more broadly. I now would like to give the audience also the opportunity to ask questions. There is a function in the webinar, a Q&A function. So you can either post your question there, and then I will share it with the panelists. And I have also here another feed from other students and audience members with questions. So perhaps I'll start with the one that I've received here. Let's start with Neil. Here's a question, I'll just read it out. With the recent popular attention to AI algorithms, what kind of applications do you see for AI in the study of global security, for example, in terms of image recognition of satellite imagery or for the analysis of economic data? I mean, that's also actually very much related to our collaboration, right? To thinking about what data we can use to understand illicit flows across continents, what data we can use to understand the interactions across levels of analysis on global security. Can you perhaps say a few words on that? And please, audience members, if you'd like to add more questions, now is the time.
Yeah, fantastic question. Of course, you know, a truth about computers, you know, any kind of algorithm, garbage in, garbage out. So it all depends on what data and what information is being fed to a system before it can spit something out. Let's just be clear about that. If you feed a system Harry Potter books, it will spit out something that looks like Harry Potter books. It won't spit out, you know, a great recipe for pasta. So it is interesting because obviously there's a new tool. There's a new tool in town that is going to be interesting for using it to maybe assess different types of data sets, putting in different types of data sets, seeing what it makes of it. However, the problem is, in the end, we want to understand global security. We don't want necessarily, imagine we have, so there's a big movement, particularly over here in the US and in the commercially and in the federal government, to build digital twins. And a digital twin is what it sounds like on the tin. It is something that reproduces the data. Imagine I had that, something that reproduces any of the data we're talking about here. It more or less reproduces it. Have I understood the system? No. have I got something that maybe will stop the next attack in the next town in the, in the Wahida or something like this? Maybe. So it could be useful for that. But have I understood something? Maybe not.
Right. Thank you. So we also need to be careful with, what the purpose actually is of what we're trying to achieve with different methods. Maybe that links very much to another question that I've received here for Inanna, because you talked before about the need to also to move beyond one's own, I would say, disciplinary, perhaps comfort zone, right? And reach out further. But here someone is asking if we should be trained in many different methods. Do we face a trade-off between the breadth of methods and the depth of methods? That is to say, what if we are trained in many different methods, but not specialized in any one particularly? If so, how do we manage this trade-off? That's probably the key question for many PhD students out there.
Yes, absolutely. No, that's a very good point. I think that it's very important first to understand different methods. And so I think the first step is not to have a preconception of what is relevant and what is not, what works and what doesn't work. So that's the first thing. You might not think, for example, that quantitative methods are necessary for your own research, but if you don't actually understand them, you will not be able to understand the data and the analysis that are generated through these methods. You will not be able to critique them. You will not be able to know the extent to which those analyses are relevant to your own work. So the first thing that I think we don't have enough of depending on the national curricula, is the breadth of the methodology in a way that is actually practically learned. We get a theoretical overview of what the different methods are, but until you actually use them in research, until you link the problem domain and the question and you deploy the methodology, and in deploying the methodology, epistemological questions arise, and this is how you you start thinking really about methods. And then you apply them and you assess the kinds of results. But we never actually do that. We get an overview and then we specialize in practice based on our understanding or based on the particular project that we're doing. But we don't have to, I don't think it's possible to specialize in everything. Obviously, it's not possible. But this is where the importance of collaborations comes in. And so perhaps we need to be less, isolated into atomistic researchers and develop really the structure for collaborative work from postgraduate work onwards. And this is still lacking. Of course, in the humanities, there is also the aesthetic of the individual scholar who sits in their study or at the computer with their own books and their own inner thoughts, etc. But I don't think this is sustainable. And most of the major advances in knowledge have been through collaborative work, have been through people who have their own specialization, who master their tools, but who also understand the importance of other tools and who extend their work to collaborate with these people who have their different strengths. And all the major, I think, projects that are now underway are of that kind. So it's important to understand, to be fluent so that you can collaborate efficiently without losing autonomy, because we need to have that intellectual autonomy, the ability to make a judgment about the relevance of particular data, about the relevance of a particular method. You don't need to be a specialist in it to be able to develop that kind of judgment, but you need to understand the method to develop that kind of judgment. And so I think this is where, if the curriculum doesn't offer you this, then I think it is very much worth spending time learning, educating ourselves. And it's an incredible journey, actually. A whole horizon of disciplines open up. Things that used to be completely insignificant to you suddenly gain new value, and it adds depth. And then also it reduces the level of dogmatism, I suppose, in each of our self-identities, because very often we are defined by our methods, And I don't think that should be the case. The method should be a question that is related to the relevance of the objective and the problem that you're addressing. So I encourage any PhD student to, I think that just a little less time spent on specialization and just spent becoming a bit more fluent about what's out there is actually, qualitatively speaking, it adds much more value.
Thanks so much. Thanks. Well, and probably also encouraging those of us who develop syllabi or the curricula to have collaboration as a major part of that, right? Because as you say, we are doing that later on, where we collaborate in different research projects. But of course, in addition to learning methods, it's crucial to understand how collaborative works early on. We're almost coming to the end, but I'd like to make sure we also just ask this other question here to Verónica, which I think is relevant for all of us. Verónica, someone asks here that what could practitioners learn from the discussed, and how could they integrate these lessons into their own work, especially given that practitioners often work on shorter timeframes. So you know both sides, right? You know the long time sounds of academia, the cycles that take sometimes over years, right? But you also know that often, I guess, practitioners have to deliver quick results or insights. Do you have any views on that? Any thoughts that you can share? Sorry, you're muted, Verónica, you're muted.
Yeah, I was saying that, yes, of course, but because we have been working on that issue specifically. So we do offer our capacity of accessing rigorous data, but also our theoretical imagination. And we do offer our vision that aims to reach complexity. But we do not have, as we said before, the tools and the media to make, to communicate our research. So, and also we aim to have some impact. So definitely the exchange and collaboration between academics and practitioners is absolutely important. I will say that in Latin America, professors, we have this tradition of aiming to have public impact. So we are more used than in the US or in the European academia to develop these exchanges. So definitely it is a very fruitful path to go.
Thank you so much. Thanks. We have 1 minute left. I'd like to just make sure I ask you one quick question to all of you that we do across the seminar series or the webinar series as an additional insight. And that is, which book or publication or podcast or other type of output would you recommend to our audience to better understand global security? So if you can take just few seconds, if you can, and give us your key recommendation. Verónica, would you like to go first?
Yes, well, thinking about methodologies and being in the field, I will recommend Rebecca Hanson's and Patricia Richards' book that is called Harassed. And it speaks about the risks of doing ethnography, being a woman in tough topics such as violence and working with armed actors and police agents. This is a topic that we don't speak a lot in academia, and I think it's a very important issue.
Thank you so much.
And lately, I will take the opportunity to make just a little advertising to the book we are going to publish this year. So it is called The Paradox of Violence in Venezuela, Revolution, Crime, and Policing During Chavismo, with David Smiles and Rebecca Hanson. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Verónica. Inanna, what's your recommendation?
Well, I had a book in mind, but I haven't read it, so I'm not going to recommend it. But I would recommend, this is very generic, but any book that looks at the collapse of past civilizations. I think that you know, if you can combine, I don't know, I can't remember if you can find this in one single book, but looking at civilizational collapse from the perspective also of in the context of environmental ecological challenges and major changes. I think this, this is the kind of perspective that is very useful to transpose to the present and ask, in our context, will we never think of human civilization as possibly collapsing? But there were civilizations of the past that no one ever thought would ever collapse, and yet they did. So thinking about the old civilizations of the Eastern Mediterranean, for example, at particular ecological transitions. Sorry, I should have prepared or gotten the specific references, but I can send them to you later on.
Thanks. I think this is already great. I think it gives lots of students out there, food for thought and to think about what that could entail. Neil, what is your recommendation?
Yeah, I would sit down in a quiet place with some peanuts and popcorn and a beverage or whatever. Get a YouTube, get the postings for YouTube and take the topic that you're most scared of in terms of methodologies, because what's the worst that can happen? You're watching it alone, you just turn it off if you don't like it, you come back to it, but it will show you the boundaries of the furthest part of the methodology space that at least give you a kind of familiarity with it. Because I think it's the familiarity across disciplines that we don't have to be experts in everything, but at least be familiar. And 2 minutes of a YouTube video, what could go wrong?
Thank you so much. Thanks. That's perfect advice. I'm sure anyone can fit in 2 minutes into their busy schedules. But thank you so much. This was a really great discussion. Thank you so much for all your inputs, your thoughts, this great conversation. Next week, we'll continue and explore different scales and spaces in global security. So we'll link this, of course, also to the discussions we had. Speakers will include very different types of space and scales as well. We have Professor Karen Martin talking about cyberspace, Professor Diane Davis talking across different scales of territory. So that should also be a very interesting discussion. It will take place next Wednesday, on the 1st of March at 12:30 and also run again for 1 hour. So thank you so much again to the speakers. Thanks also to the audience. And I hope next time we'll also be able to speak in person. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.